Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Wil Talk with Artists. My name is Martha Campbell, and I am MFA's Communications Manager. Our digital discussion tonight is with watercolorist and wearable artist creator, Stacy Lund Levy. Stacy started her career in the medical field and now uses her love of medicine and anatomy to create detailed watercolor works. On top of her painting, Stacy also works to create wearable art, developing sculptures for the human form. I would also like to introduce the host of our show, Wil Scott. Wil is an art historian with an extensive career as a photographer and the former head of adult programs for the National Gallery of Art. He is uniquely qualified to help bridge the gap between artists and the public, and he'll be our guide into the art world tonight. So I think with all that said, we can start. Wil?
Well, thank you, Martha, for your introduction and for your assistance each week. It really makes the program flow because Martha is on top of everything and she knows when to cut me off. And Stacy, thank you for joining in and participating. I think your work is very strong in terms of your watercolors, but you have an unusual background, which I think it adds a kind of dimension to our conversation and to your work that I'd like to explore. And also, we're going to wrap up with some of those wearable constructions that you make that are just, I mean, I've not seen anybody outside of costume and stage design do anything like that. So I think they're quite fascinating. Anyway, Stacy, why don't you just sort of very briefly bring us up to where we are today in terms of your training and your preparation. You say on your bio on your website that you started creating artistically when you were a small child, but then you have an interesting educational path that we can talk about.
Well, first, thank you for having me on. I've watched quite a few Wil Talks and I really enjoy them. Growing up, my mother was very artistic and she really promoted everything. So we did a lot of macaroni art and some painting and finger painting and all kinds of things. My dad was more into science and he pushed that pretty heavily. So, and I liked both. I think both of them interact wonderfully. And initially I wanted to go to medical school and decided against that after I met a medical illustrator. So schooling for medical illustration, there's a couple schools, there were 5, and they take 5 to 8 students each year. And you learn both. So you spend the mornings with the medical students, and then in the afternoon, you do illustration work with the artists in the medical art department. And I love doing it. And I had kids, and then after I had kids, running a freelance business was a little bit tough. So I didn't go back to it. And I started freelancing fine art kind of things. And it just sort of morphed into what I'm doing today. After it being included, I started working with the Baltimore Watercolor Society and the Philadelphia Watercolor Society. And there's just opportunities there to exhibit. I like really detailed stuff, which is what drew me to medical illustration. And I use that in my fine arts. So it's the best of both worlds.
How long ago did you make that transition into being primarily a creative artist?
Probably about 20 years ago.
20 years ago?
15.
Well, I'm fascinated as an art historian in the fact that you had this training as a medical illustrator. And I want you to either let me and the audience know that what I'm about to ask you is true or that I'm completely misinformed. The question is, my understanding of medical illustration is that it's not entirely just a scientific reproduction of what's observed in the anatomy, that there has to be a creative, interpretive aspect in order for it to be meaningful and understandable to those who are going to use the illustrations. Is that true?
That's absolutely true. Because one of the classes that I went through was a surgical rotation. So you would go in, the patient knew, and in teaching hospitals, go in and watch a surgery. Well, when you see a surgery, everything is the same color, basically. It's pretty much red or pink. Yeah. And unless you know the structures that are inside the body and you know them very well, you have no idea what's going on. It literally just looks like a mass. So a medical illustrator has to separate out when they draw the structures and the procedure of exactly what each piece looks like. And, like lungs typically are blue, purple, there's certain colors that sort of match up with each structure.
Mhm.
And on top of that, you're illustrating a procedure. So you need to go through and say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is what happens. This is what's on top. You're putting a 3D process into a 2D series of illustrations. And so, and it has to be more or less attractive and clear, very, very clear.
Now, this is where I really wanted to dig down to, and I'm glad that I was correct, because I don't know what I'd be asking you next if I wasn't. But anyway, the way that you describe that is the way that I've been led by reading to understand the process and the field. But it sounds like there's room for possible creativity, or maybe more positively said, or more negatively said, misinterpretation. So how are the students instructed? How were you instructed to deal with that? Because you're not being asked to just reproduce what you see when somebody opens up a body. Right.
Well, as you get jobs, I mean, you're working with a surgeon or a doctor or a company. And usually if it's like I used to work for a company in California that they did, in fact, everybody's probably seen one, and they might've seen one of my drawings, are pamphlets. And, you go in for a colonoscopy or whatever, and you get a pamphlet and they say, this is what's going to happen. So one, it has to be kind of friendly. It doesn't need, you have to give it a friendly bend. You don't want to scare the person. And then you're working with somebody, either the person who's the project manager, who's working with the surgeon, or a doctor of some sort. So you have the technical, the scientific information. Everything is very clear. The person is looking at your illustrations. They're making sure the size relations are correct, the procedures exactly as it's going to be, and it's clear. The information is clear. Is that sort of?
Yes, that's very nicely expressed and described. Do you feel that leaves any room for creativity? And maybe a better question is, did that learning process and that experience of working in that field contribute something positive to your ongoing work as a watercolorist?
I think it did. First, on the watercolor aspect, the instructor that was teaching watercolor at the time, there were two, and they were both fabulous in their own way. So I got skill-wise, couldn't be better. There are certain things, and in fact, there's somebody on the call I know that I did the work for, and it was a piece, apparatus or a appliance to put in teeth, to a palate expander. And so I did the drawings, and it was teeth and, the inside of your mouth, and I put a little bit of reflected pink on the teeth just to make it a little bit more cohesive and a little more attractive to look at. And they called me back and they said, why are the teeth pink? Like, you can't do that. And that's, so you have to think about who your audience is, either in the fine arts world or the medical world or children's illustration, who is looking at it and what they're actually seeing, and think about that. Because then I had to take the pink off the teeth. And to me, artistically, it wasn't as good, but it was certainly, I guess, clearer.
But it made you think. It made you think about what you were doing and why you were doing it.
Exactly. And you have to think about shapes. You have to think about relationships size-wise. If something, if you put a heart that's like 3 times the size that it's supposed to be in your body, that's incorrect. Yeah. And so my fine art, it's helped immensely in my fine art. Relationships of size, of color, depth. Yes, immensely.
In your training, education, did you have any formal training in the history of art? Were you in any way introduced to great icons of the watercolor medium or anything like that?
Somewhat, but not very much. My mom took us to museums. So, but as as a little kid, I guess it impacts you on some level. And there's certain people that certain artists that I just think are fabulous. But
we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Because as an art historian, I can't resist. I see things in your work that make me think of other artists that are well known, and so we'll explore that just a little bit. The last thing, though, before we look at the first image, which I think everybody is going to love, I know I do, is in Western art, at least, since really since antiquity, but very much since the Renaissance, art and science have often been understood to be intimately related. When you think of people like Leonardo or Michelangelo.
Definitely,
Even.
yes.
Yeah, at other times, particularly in more recent times, there's often this sort of war between science and art, which is, I think, artificial. So do you see your knowledge of science, of biology and physiology, as contributing to all of your work, or just certain aspects like your work in figure study or portraiture?
I would say all, because specifically in portraiture and figure work, because structurally, we studied anatomy, and we were with medical students when we dissected a body. So like even just I think the problem sometimes is when you learn how to draw in elementary school or kindergarten, your teacher probably was an artist and they taught you that a tree was a stick with a ball on the top of it. And then nobody ever asked you to look at a tree again, or if you're going to draw it, you're not going to, so when people 50s and 60s, you draw a tree, they draw a stick with a ball on the top.
Yeah, yes.
So when you study anatomy, you know that eyes are set back in your head. So this whole part of your face is recessed and it's going to be shadowy, and your cheeks stick out from that. So they're going to be a highlight. So there's all these different things, aspects of that. And that plays through with everything. Always look for the shadows, always look for the prominence. So across the board.
Well, that's a great sort of setup for looking at a lot of your work, even the very first one. So Martha, if you want to bring up that first image. As a dog owner and a dog lover, I think this is just a great image. And one of the things I love about it is the variation of light and color. That's the kind of thing that, even though I can't paint in watercolors at all, I understand the complexity and difficulty of doing that. So Stacy, would you begin by just saying a little bit about your choice of papers and your preparation? I mean, do you use a really wet, heavy brush or a dry, those kinds of things? Just sort of sketch in, if you will, your process.
This was one of my favorite ways to paint is to use a limited palette. And this is 2 colors for the entire painting. So it's burnt sienna, which is like a warm orangey brown color, and ultramarine blue, which is a really kind of deep, cool blue. And when you mix those 2 colors together, you can get black, which is at my lower right on the screen and the nose, or you can get ranges between orange and brown and blues and grays and everything in between, warm gray, blue gray. And then the white of this dog is the paper. So I use Arches 300-pound paper. And the reason I use it is because it doesn't warp. It's more expensive and it's thicker, but it doesn't warp. So then when you go to take the images to get them framed, they don't have to press them or anything. And you don't really have to stretch it, which is something that you sometimes have to do with watercolor paper. I use the biggest brush I can use, because if you get a good quality brush, you can use the point of it to get a really fine line, but the actual bulk of the fiber of it, the hairs of it, or the synthetic hairs of it, will hold more fluid. So if you're going to do a really fine line, you can draw a really, really long, or paint a really, really long line without picking your brush up.
When you discuss the paper, sometimes I print my photographs on watercolor paper, and I've liked Arches because of that thickness and stiffness. How did you come to choose that? Was there a sort of a process of experimentation or did somebody just tell you if you're going to soak it with a lot of water, you're going to want something that's heavier?
No, I tried a bunch of different papers out, and I used to go to the Maryland Institute College of Art bookstore. I absolutely love that place. And you could buy samples there, and I bought a bunch of different samples. And then I think Arches is a fairly well-known, like most people paint on Arches. There's a couple other different kinds, Fabriano and Saunders Waterford, that are nice, but they just suck the paint right up, and you can't get dark darks, or at least I can't get dark darks with this. I just like the quality of the paper. And recently, apparently, it's been changed. It was in the same Italian group French group that printed made all their paper, and really good quality control. And then they sold the company like maybe 5 years ago, and people have had problems with it, but I haven't had problems with it. And I have a huge amount of it in my studio. So I'm sticking with what I have.
Well, that's why you're not having problems. You got the good stuff.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay, just one more quick question, then we'll move along because
Okay.
you've got a lot of beautiful things for us to look at. So you paint from light to dark.
Not
right?
necessarily. No,
No?
traditionally, yeah, people have, when you're taught watercolor, start light, build, build, build. I
Yeah.
like to put at least one dark somewhere in there that's really, really dark, and then put my lights on, and then you have to close up the value between.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think if you, and when I teach, people paint something and they really like it, but it needs a little bit more, and they always say, I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up.
Yeah.
Well, if you got your dark down there, you have to build toward the middle. You're stuck. So I
Yeah.
think it's be bold in the beginning and then work backwards from there.
Yeah, that's good to remember. Be bold in the
Be
beginning.
bold. Yes.
Okay, let's look at the next image, please. This is the kind of thing that I personally like to do as a photographer. But in looking at this, there's a couple questions that come to mind, but there's also something about this that I think demonstrates your skill and your training. I think it's very hard to catch a person like the woman we see from behind, and you've got that twist in her hip and the tilt of her head. How did you prepare for this? Did you have a model, or did you take a photograph, or did you just see this particular place, and I'm curious where it is, and make a quick sketch? How did you construct this?
I very rarely do a sketch because, one, there's no time and I don't carry the stuff around. With the advent of the cell phone, it's changed my abilities, I would have to say. And somebody last night on the call that was with the MFA for the member show said that they annoy their just annoy their family with taking pictures. And I do the same thing. So this was in Rehoboth Beach. This is one of my favorite little delis, and it's arenas. And I shot, I don't know, 50 pictures because I really I love clutter. There's a ton of clutter in the place. There's all kinds of stuff all over the wall. And she was really fabulous. This was our waitress. And so I just shot a bunch of pictures, and then I kind of collaged in whatever was around. So
now, okay, so that's very typical today to use your cell phone in that way in replacing the laborious and time-consuming process of sketching. But still, I think that's a very dynamic pose when you see somebody from behind and they have this, extra long t-shirt on. One of the things I see when I look at a lot of work in our exhibits and everywhere is that somebody does this great painting and then they don't quite get the anatomy right. I keep looking at this and thinking, you got that exactly right. Do you attribute that to your anatomical studies and your medical illustration training?
Well, first, thank you. That's really nice to say. I think some of it is because you sort of think about you think what's under the form. She had that
Yes.
huge t-shirt on,
Yeah.
so basically there's you see her shoulders, her legs, and her hips. That's pretty much it. But
Yeah.
also figure drawing. I love figure drawing, and I usually go to Micah. Well, pre-COVID, I would go to Micah, and the more you draw, the more you think about things or how they relate. And when your weight is settled, it's if you shift your body and your weight is on a leg, then there's a certain line that follows from the head to the hip to the foot because your weight is on that leg. And that's kind of sort of the way I think about it, depending on how the person is standing or sitting.
That's interesting that you explained it in that way, which very much reveals your experience in your own personal study. William Hogarth, an 18th century English artist who was also an illustrator, called it the line of beauty. And it's basically a sort of sensuous S curve that he said in his theory derived from the human body, and which was one of the things that animated all the great classical sculpture and Renaissance figure painting. And this would be an example, although don't seem to be familiar with that artist, who's not very well known at all today, especially not in the United States. But that's the line of beauty.
Oh, well, I'm going to use that directly from now on.
Okay, okay, yeah. Let's look at the next image. This, I think, is a very challenging pose. It looks so natural and easy, but the fact that the figure looks so natural is a testament to, I think, your skill in doing this. So is this a member of your family, a friend, somebody who you could catch unawares asleep and study them slowly?
This is my daughter, and this is my sister-in-law's living room, not what, minus the plants and the trees and stuff. During a family dinner, she slipped off and fell asleep in the other room. And like I said, I've annoyed my family to no end, the entire batch, everybody. And I like the way she was, one, I always look for light. So the light was coming into the window and highlighting certain parts and then dropping other things back into shadow. And I just loved the way it looked. And then I'm trying to get more loose in my interpretations of what I draw and what I paint. And she loves nature. She's studying botany. So I just started adding things, and then I just added a little more and a little more and a little more. But the pose of that, if you look at that, this is another figure drawing aspect, is that if you were to measure the size of her head from the forehead to her chin, her feet in the front are bigger than that.
Yeah.
And everybody knows, if you draw somebody, your head, size wise shouldn't be that small, but in foreshortening, that's what happens.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. And that's exactly what, as a hypercritical trained art historian, that's what I was noticing, is that this isn't classical proportions of the human form. This is reality of how our eye observes form of a figure reclining like this. But more importantly, you began by talking about the light, the way that you've captured those loose strands of hair at the back of her head and that bright highlight the light coming in from the window, makes me want to ask you this. I alluded to the history of watercolors. Basically, since the watercolor became more popular, beginning in the 17th century in Holland as a study tool, more or less, but then in the 19th century in France as something that would be seriously approached and illustrated, and England in the 19th century also. There's sort of two ways to approach watercolor at that sort of international level. Either very loose, like Turner, the 19th century English master painter, or there's an English tradition that we don't see much more because it's fallen out of favor, where a watercolor looks almost like an oil paint. It's very precise, it's very tightly controlled, and the washes are not really allowed to be freely expressed. Does any of that make any sense to you? Did you have any kind of study that would, or on your own observation of museum collections where you're conscious of, because you're somewhere right in the middle. You've got
Yes.
balance between these two traditions, and I see it in all of your work.
Yes, well, one, I take an art history class every week, which Jackie is in. And so we've studied Turner and quite a few other painters, well, quite a few artists, multitudes. But today, if you look at any juried show, international or national show or a local show, there are it's the same two distinct styles. Some people just can take water and slap it down there and it's very abstract and you step back and it looks fabulous. And then there are other people like Lauren McCracken is one of the top, international watercolorists today. His stuff looks like it's just sitting in front of you. Every line is tight. It's all perfectly done. So
Yeah.
I know both ends of that scale, and I would like to close it up. And Mary White is another one of my favorite watercolorists. So her figures are really, really realistic, and they're kind of in a work situation. All of them have, they're in their own environment. And then as further you get away on the canvas from the figure, that goes into almost nothing. They're very abstract.
Right.
And so I would love to be able to kind of marry those two things. So we'll see what happens.
Well, I think you're marrying them here. You may want to do it in a different way and to a different degree, but that's immediately struck me, particularly with this composition. Okay,
This is one of the later.
Pardon?
This is one of the more recent paintings that I've done.
Oh, okay. Okay. The next image, I think, is Gray Matter in Bloom. And you're going to I'm just going to ask you to riff on this, because on the screen, all I can tell is that it looks like there's a lot of notes and little written things in the background. And oh, now I can see it's even within the figure. So tell us what this is all about.
So
Oh, wow.
I'll back out. You can see this little truck here and the chemical symbols. So this is my son, and I call it, whoa, is anybody getting sick yet? I call it Gray Matter and Bloom. He was cleaning out his room, and these were all, he's a chemistry major, and these are all of his notes, and well, not all of them, but text, notes, quizzes, all that kind of stuff. And it was a shame to throw them out, because some of the text is really tightly put together, so it's got a darker value. Some of it's more spread out. He had a whole ton of people from physics jumping off buildings and springing around and stuff like that. And they were all really great in just their little parts individually. And I had taken this picture of him, or a reference that had those glasses on. So I just decided to, start putting them together.
Okay, you said it's collage on cradle board. I'm not familiar with cradle board. What's that?
Cradle board, and I thought I had one here. It's just a flat, like I don't know what the surface of this one is, some kind of hardwood, and then it's got like a 2-inch border around it that sits it away from the wall. So it's a perfectly flat surface, and you can paint anything on it. Usually they're gessoed.
Yeah.
And,
okay. Now, thank you. And does your son have curly hair like that, or was that an artistic liberty you took?
It's big, really big, and it's wild. So that's why I like the paisley. I liked all the curly things in there, and it's fun to paint and draw. And this turned out to be just really a lot of fun. I used a hole puncher to get the little curly cues. I can probably go in with a mouse. It's kind of hard to, no, I can't move it around once I open it up. But so I could press through the yellow paper. I punched different patterns in it so it would show the pattern below.
Now, were all of these little notes and things on the wall in his room, or did you have to imagine how you wanted to combine them and create them?
Yeah, it's just ripped out of notebooks. And actually, sadly, they were on the floor of his room in a giant pile, and he was going to just recycle them. And I saved a lot of it and used it.
That is a lot of fun. And just a little personal aside, when I was in college, my hair looked a lot like this.
Yeah.
Not quite that long, but
yeah,
that was the general idea. So that is fun. And I think it's striking that you gave him these black reflective sunglasses with a design on them, and yet you still got so much personality out of it. Usually if you hide somebody's eyes, you kind of, the old cliche about the eyes being the windows to the soul. So
yeah.
The next image I think is very beautiful. I love blue, and I think the way that you've represented this scene, these figures underwater, is fascinating. Is water a theme that interests you a lot? Because this doesn't look like something you could just do as a one-off.
Oh no, I've always been a swimmer, and I love the pool. And I think they're all on this call. The woman in the front is Melissa. She's a good friend of mine. Janine is the one diving in, and she is the owner of the pool. And Heidi is in the back, like pushing herself down to the ground. And the latest iPhones are waterproof. And these ladies and a couple others, we tread water together. And I started shooting pictures underwater, and they are it's with the way the sun comes over, if the clouds go out, the pictures are amazing. And I had a great time. I'm hoping they did. They're great models and really good sports. Yeah.
You mean they kept diving in for you?
Yeah, over and over and flipping, and yeah, really cool. It was a lot of fun.
Now here's the point where, as a photographer, why would you want to labor over painting this in watercolor when you just described that you have an iPhone that takes images underwater? I'm just curious.
So one, I like to pick things that are challenging. And one of the things in watercolor, or one of the problems in watercolor, is reserving whites.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the bubbles coming out of the figure and all of the figures, that was a challenge for me. So I wanted to try that. Also, this background, I literally poured paint on the paper in all different colors. And it's just fun. The water is just fun.
Okay.
So
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
But I'm still fascinated with the patterns on the bottom of the pool.
Mhm.
Are all of those what look like white lines actually reserved white paper?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Now I'm really impressed. The bubbles, I've seen people do bubbles, but those lines I can't even wrap my head around doing that, but you did a brilliant job.
Multiple tricks. The more you do, the more tricks you learn. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about BWS in New York.
Okay. So this is my friend Cheryl. And she was standing in front of this window, and I don't think a lot of people don't look at this, but there's a whole lot going on back here.
Oh, yeah.
So when I saw the reflections on the side and the reflections of the truck, and that's me standing in there behind the bike, kind of outlined. She was standing in front of that with her black bag and she's got really beautiful white hair and the red jacket and the stripes. The whole thing just struck me. And I said, Cheryl, turn, like she thought I wanted her out of the picture. And I actually wanted her in the picture. So she was kind of in motion and I caught one photo. And that just kind of, whatever it was, inspired me. Also the challenge of keeping the slats white and getting all of the information between the slats in the background. That's kind of was very.
I'm not surprised that you kept her in the image, because with the bright red and with her figure being close to the picture plane, it makes people work. As you said, people don't necessarily notice all things going on in the background, but if I were going to take a picture, which I like to do in a city, it's that stuff that's reflected on the stone, on the my far right as I'm gesturing, and in the glass and all of that. And what you did was essentially, I think, with your composition and your choice of color, you made everybody's eye usually goes to a human figure. So you made them work to see what you've really accomplished and how carefully you've looked. And that's, I think, makes this a very interesting work. But it is nothing, in my opinion, compared to the level of interest in the last two pieces that we're going to look at. I mean, this is something I've never seen anybody do quite what you're doing here. So why don't you show us the first image and describe a little bit about what it is and why it is. Yeah, good.
So that's my daughter.
And
that's my son moving the crank. And this, I built this there's a competition in Maryland called Manic Art, and it's sculpture on the human form. So it doesn't have to, it's wearable art, something that's not like just fabric. So this is wood and ball bearings and those little animals. I'm constantly trying to clean my house out. They were animals that my kids played with them when they were younger, and I sort of bedazzled them and drilled holes in them and then mounted them on this and then it wasn't enough. So I lit the thing up, and this wasn't the most comfortable one that I've made, but it worked. And so anyway, that's
so you did it because there was a competition and the theme or requirements of the competition interested you.
Yes.
And was that the first one you ever did?
That was the second one that I did. The first one I did was called Read More, and I had I picked all of our favorite books, my daughter, because she volunteered to model for me, and then each piece of the dress was part of was based on the books. And this is the hat that she wore. So one of the pieces was Alice in Wonderland. So I learned hat making through this experience. And this is Sculpey clay that's in the top, the actual cat. And it's fun to do, but it's also, I think this is where the science part comes in. It's kind of engineering because it's got to fit, it's got to be weighted, it's got to be relatively comfortable for the person to wear. And so that
So
was
what happens to them after you've made them?
unfortunately, or fortunately, they're all in my house. So some of them have been on display various places. There was one that went to the, well, they've been various places in shows, but yes, they're here. And so I'm saying they're taking up a lot of space.
Well, they're fascinating, but that's what I was thinking. I mean, would you put them on a mannequin if you wanted to display them, or somebody expressed interest in purchasing them? Would you advise them to put them on a mannequin or do something like that? Or
Yes, they're all on mannequins right now. And in fact, I probably should have pulled some in here so you could see, because one of my neighbors had a yard sale and she used to be a dress designer. So I have 6 mannequins with heads. So the hats,
geez.
the whole deal can fit on there. And yeah, so I bought
it was
those.
destined to happen.
It was destined to happen. But I wanted to show this. This is the prototype for the skirt. So I built it in cardboard and then made a gear to figure out how it was going to spin, because, you know, prior to anything else, I wanted to know that it was probably going to work.
Well, I see that we're having such a good time, or at least I'm having a good time chatting, that we're cutting into our time for Q&A. So let's just go to the last one, which to me is the most fascinating of these constructions of the two, and the one that you described. And I'll tell you why first, and then let you have at it, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Play the little video. Now, I'm just riffing, but because it has to do with flight in a way, the umbrellas, makes me think of Leonardo, because you're also a medical illustrator, and you're very you're excellent at representing the human body, and of course that was another one of his interests. And at the same time, it's kind of Mary Poppins, you know, the umbrellas, and then it's kind of like those dinosaurs that had an important role in oh God, Senior Moment. The movie's about the guy that recreates the dinosaurs, but you know what I mean. One of the dinosaurs has a frill that keeps coming out, kind of like
yeah, it's terrifying. Yes.
Yeah,
Jurassic Park.
Yes, Jurassic Park. So all of these things are going on. Was any of that in the back of your mind when you made this?
It absolutely is, because this Leonardo did the ornithopter, I think that's how it's said, and it was a prototype of a helicopter. So who knew, you know, at that time? So this is called Vortex Rider, and I have some kind of weird thing with umbrellas. I've painted them a lot, and I think the mechanism in an umbrella is absolutely fascinating. So I had this idea that if, you know, you can push it up, you can definitely pull it down. And so I had to take a bunch of umbrellas apart, and then there are pulleys, a whole pulley system on those 3 layers to make it work. And as my husband knows, I didn't have it perfected until the very last second. And since then, I found a mechanism that can, and it's the same thing you put on your person to pull out your like ID that's on a chain. I can now make it snap back up without.
Good. Good. Yeah. Well, since we're running out of time, I just have to say, Stacy, that I love your work. I think you're a master of watercolor, and the way that you combine these sort of worlds of science and the fine arts in such a creative and unusual way, particularly in these wearable art constructions. I mean, it's just great to get to know you and more about your work. So we've only got about 15 minutes, but I'm sure people have questions about something that's so unusual in the way that you've created these things.
Just as a reminder, you can type out a question in the chat, you can raise your hands, and we'll just try to get everyone in an orderly fashion. But I do see we already have one in the chat from earlier from David, who asks if you use mask or not.
I do. And I use masking in layers. So not only, a lot of people use masking just to reserve white. I put it on sequential layers. So if I'm doing hair, I'll put on a layer of mask, just individual hairs. Then I'll paint like with the painting that was in this, put a ochre color, variety of yellows, paint more mask on, then browns. And it's almost like frosting your hair when you dye your hair. The unfortunate thing is at the end, sometimes when you pull all that off, I mean, there's hair like overkill. So then you have to dull it down. But yes, I use mask. Not a ton, but a good amount, especially in hair. I definitely use it in hair, pet fur, that kind of thing.
So
Jackie?
I think it would be really incredible if Stacy's mannequins could be a window display downtown, in somebody's windows, that they could all be set up like
Yeah.
accessories in their windows, that they would be like the centerpieces. Can't you just see that, Will?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a terrific idea.
I think
Yeah.
that's a fabulous idea.
Well, he used to do I don't know if he does as creative windows as he used to, but he used to have whoever did his windows did very thematic, very creative stuff.
Whose
So
window?
that at Zachary's.
Oh, Zachary's, yeah.
Zachary's has great windows, and they do have done some really creative. I just can see her mannequin.
Yeah,
It's like a pandemic party in his windows.
yeah.
We have to figure out a way to make that happen.
Well, everybody, all businesses
Right.
downtown.
Yeah, let me give that some thought.
Yeah. Other questions?
We have another one in the chat from Nada, who asks if you have any interest or influence from pop art in your style, or if you see any.
Not a whole lot. I would have to say the collage stuff that I do has the most, is influenced the most, but not a whole lot. I mean, I like it, don't get me wrong, but I not so much.
That's an interesting question, though. I think I hadn't thought of that myself, and it's a great question. It makes me think that for me, your use, especially in the gray matter, that approach is more like Spitters and some of the Dada artists who would combine detritus. The pop artists are choosing individual objects because they want to make some kind of comment.
Yeah.
Usually. So maybe does that make any sense to you, Stacy? Are you interested in Dada?
Some. I mean, some. I think it's fascinating, and I've seen other people's work that I think is amazing. And honestly, there's enough stuff in the studio that I could probably go wild, but
Yeah.
There's only so much time in
Yep.
the day. Yeah.
Okay.
There is a very nice comment from Susan in the chat who says, Stacy, I was memorized by your tub painting hanging currently at MFA.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that. There's my father-in-law, Marty, his painting is at the MFA right now, and right next to it is my son in the bathtub. So it's the MFA. Go to the MFA.
Okay, well, if everybody has gotten their questions answered through the course of our conversation, and there aren't any more, we'll wrap up. So this is your last chance. Martha, did you want to ask a question?
I don't have a question. I feel really bad because I love watercolor. And I love your style. I don't have any questions though, but I do have just sort of the close for today.
Okay.
So unless there's anything else people want to say.
Okay.
Okay. The first thing I want to mention is Collector's Choice tickets are on sale. Collector's Choice will be October 24th at Volvo Cars Annapolis and online. And if you purchase a ticket one way or the other, you can switch it at any time up until the event. So if you buy a virtual ticket but decide you want to come in person, we can do that. Just call the gallery and we can talk about that. And then I'll also plug our next Wil Talk, which will be October 19th. We'll be chatting with abstract painter Christine Zmuda. So look forward to that.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks, Martha, for your excellent help as usual. And most of all, thanks, Stacy. It was really nice to meet you and to see this wonderful work that you're creating.
Yeah,
And thank you for running images.
Yeah, yeah.
No worries. It would have
All
been
right.
very dull.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope I'll see some of you in 2 weeks.